welcome to problem-based cybersecurity training and why it matters. My name is Brian Sullivan. I'll be the moderator this lovely morning for me. I believe it's afternoon for the other gentlemen in this webinar. That being said, my guests here are Eoin Keary, CEO and founder of EdgeScan, and Jim Manico, CEO and founder of Manico. Now, that being said, these gentlemen have a long history together and they do love to talk. So we will start this off rather quickly with our first question, which is, what is problem-based cybersecurity training? And Jim Manico, I know that's your specialty, so I'll hand that off to you and we'll get this show on the road.
Problem-based security training, right? So when I hear that term, I think about doing training, talking about different vulnerabilities, right? Talking about things that can go wrong in an application. Sure. I do like that kind of training because it really does inform, it informs developers and other tech professionals what can go wrong. And I think it's a great starting point, right? For any kind of technical training in the world of security. Here's the ways we can actually cause damage. Here's the problems that can be caused. Like, here's no BS real world demonstrations of how to attack. Here's how you can attack labs. I love it. I think that's a good start. Yeah. I also like solution-based training where I talk defense. But go, Eoin.
Yeah.
Go
solution. For it, yeah, we'll keep the solution piece for the next webinar, right? But yeah, what is it? Problem-based. For me, problem-based is like using case studies to educate folks on how to avoid previous mistakes, right? Gotcha. So Jim, like you train all over the world, and I'm guessing in a lot of cases you'll see your organization struggling with the same problems, the same content. Cross-site scripting is 25 years old. We're still finding it. SQL injection, top 10 stuff, authorization, authentication, crypto, right? So for me, problem-based training is around using those example vulnerabilities.
I got you. Yep.
So it's like, hey, developer community, here's your application. Here's the vulnerability management or pen testing we've done on it. Here's some real world examples of code, which is vulnerable. Let's talk about your code. Let's talk about your baby. We won't call your baby ugly, but we can certainly improve how your baby looks, right? So for me, it's like when developers see their own code that they wrote, they can get a bit blushful because when you talk about the this line of code here is the culprit, this line of code here or this method here on the code is a vulnerable method, and somebody in the room has written that and they're sort of, oh shit, I wrote this piece of code, right? But for me, problem-based training is very much people remember this, people will learn it. People don't want their, it's not about not having people's code and shaming people. Everybody makes mistakes. There's tons of vulnerabilities out there, right? But like it's like the type of thing is to give examples of hacks, exploits, insecure code, weak processes as well. It doesn't have to be necessarily code all the time, and maybe logical weaknesses, walking through how you exploited it, how you breached it, how you found the vulnerability, pulling up that code, talking to the people that wrote the code, and in effect saying to them, hey, I know you wrote this code, I know it's vulnerable, let's talk about how to make it less vulnerable.
I love it.
The hope for me, Jim, is that it sticks better. It resonates more, and people will say, now I understand it because you use my code as an example. That's sort of, yeah.
Now I'm with you. And so let's talk about that a little bit more. So I like case studies because it brings the real world into the technical theory. Like when I want to talk about server-side request forgery, this is like one of the newer attack categories in the API world, I dare say, right? It's becoming more of a problem with microservices. But like SSRF, I like to talk about Capital One because we understand the forensics of what happened, and we can like go through that code in great detail, show the URL parameter, show exactly what happened. And that's just not some theory. That's like a real world exploit that took out 100 million records. And taking it a step deeper, like I worked with other assessment companies. And now, Eoin, in my mind, there are no other assessment companies. But
thank you, Jim.
No, when I work with assessment companies like EdgeScan, it is really interesting to be able to pull down vulnerability data and with respect, not to shame, but to show developers SQL injection, not theory, not in a certain attack, but in their code base that I just scanned. And especially if you do that respectfully, don't try to shame anyone. you're bringing it to their doorstep. You're bringing it right to their home and their code.
Amen.
And it does make the training radically more impactful. That's why working with scanning partners as an educator is really helpful when
it's useful.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
Good. Happy, Brian? Is that enough for you? Have we answered the question correctly? What do we get out of 10?
Me, gentlemen.
10 out of 10? That's an 8 out of 10. We get an 8 out of 10?
You got an 8 on that one. We'll see how you do with the next one. So the next question is it effective and why? But I believe that we just kind of covered that with that answer.
There's a few things there as well, Brian. Just, what about effectiveness? So when you get an example of insecure code on a blog, Jim has been doing this for years. When I worked with Jim in the training space, we did a bit together. The example code you give it's sort of, you try to make it as clear as possible and as typical as possible. In many cases, when you talk about example code or example vulnerabilities, sometimes it isn't that code. I mean, the code isn't as clear, the code isn't as clean, the vulnerability isn't as apparent. So the vulnerability testing, the penetration test, or whatever that may be, has found the issue. When you look at the code, just start scratching your head saying, I'm not seeing, based on the blog I read about SQL injection, I'm not seeing where this is, because sometimes the actual code is a bit convoluted. So it would take the likes of Jim, for example, to walk people through that code to sort of say, yeah, this isn't your atypical insecure code example, but when we walk through that piece of code, or when we walk through the steps, the vulnerability management system like EdgeCam, how it found that vulnerability, and then you map it back on to talk to the developer about how to sort of manifest it. It's much more useful because code,
absolutely,
when we write code, it's not always vanilla. Sometimes it's complex, and maybe you've had some legacy code and you've had to add to it, and that's the reason the vulnerability is there. So it's not always black and white. Would you agree?
I'm with you. And for some frameworks, like I have like 6, 7, 8 different layers: configuration layer. I have like another more service level configuration layer, and then I have going down, and it gets really convoluted, and like vulnerabilities are sometimes like really hard to track down. And if I can again work with like an edge scan, love me some edge scan, I can look at, here's a problem with the code where the problem happened. Even better, here's a real world exploit that we use to test it against your website that shows the vulnerability. Now there's the debate is over. I've had developers who built entire SQL injection architectures without meaning to. They just built a whole like data access layer that took snippets of SQL as a parameter. I can't lock that down reasonably. And I'm like, this entire data access layer is written with an insecure design. It's going to need to be fundamentally revisited. I had a developer with like the architect who built it. And he starts screaming at me saying, you're a liar. You're a liar. This is not real. And I'm like, whoa. Everyone slow down. I'm not trying. I'm just, I'm trying to harm anyone. But if I'm like, look, here's the code. Here's an example of how I would steal data from your database with this exact feature. And let me show you how to fix it. Guess what? That debate is over.
Oh, you're right, man. You're right.
No debate. Real world, and people are listening. And I'll tell you this, Owen, no matter how respectful I am, when I show developers like stuff going wrong in their code, I'm always triggering them emotionally. They're always like, what did I just do? They're embarrassed. They're like,
but it's not about that though. It's not about that. It's about when if you do it next year, if you do the training next year, the next time you do it, hopefully it's not your code up on the screen. What does that mean? It means maybe you've learned how not to do it, so therefore you'll do it properly, right? But you make a really good point, Jim, around design. Sometimes when you find vulnerabilities, it's not a line of code fix, or it's not turning something into a parameterized query or contextual output encoding or whatever, in terms of cross-site scripting. It can be more that the design is completely broken. And and sometimes problem-based training, you can't really get that out of a book. You can't get that off a blog. And maybe the value of problem-based training in that case is to talk about, well, why is this design broken? Why is it going to be impossible to fix? Because if you fix this thing, you break that thing. And I think you can't really get to that point in terms of trying to impair knowledge with people unless you use their code as an example, right? So I think that's a really good point you made there.
Yeah, I mean, unless you make it real for them, unless you can show them something that hits home for them, you know, how is it going to resonate?
Yeah, like that's something we do in EdgeScan is sometimes, you know, we find some critical and high risk, and all critical and high risk issues in EdgeScan get some expert validation to make sure that they're real and exploitable, as opposed to you know, an automated scanner. And there is occasions with some of our clients that they need us to record a video of the exploit to give to somebody so they can explain it, you know, to an executive to explain, oh, all right, this is how the guys via command line, and you'd walk through that on a video with them about how you got access to table data or something on a database or whatever it may be, or you bypass an authorization issue or something like that. And the idea would be is that it's sort of, you know, you can't really do that, you know, in many, particularly in complex edge cases, you can't really do that by reading a book on how to not do SQL injection, because sometimes, you know, systems, enterprise systems can be 20 years old. We've augmented them over the last 20 years. Nobody wants to turn it off. Nobody really knows how it all works. We all know how a piece of it works. And as we augment and build out an enterprise system, you know, these things happen. And one of the values of problem-based training is to sort of, as I said, to talk about a vulnerability in terms of teaching how not to do that vulnerability or how to prevent it, how to write code securely, but then contextualizing it into something that's meaningful to the developers in that company or that organization. It really gels. It gels much more because you're talking about a vulnerability in their language, on their system, and something that most people in the room would understand and know. Yeah.
And being able to influence developers is fundamental. It's why we're doing training. It's not to check a box, because developers need to often do things differently, and and the engineering techniques to do so are complicated and many, and the learning doesn't end when it comes to security. So these, if you really want to influence a team to actually do secure coding in a better way, these subtle points and all this nuance it's not a nice to have, it's fundamental. You like say one thing wrong in a training class that is inappropriate for a developer, you lost them for the entire class. So all this nuance and how you approach and what you show them and bringing it home to their world specifically is necessary to have successful training.
No, and I like where we're going with this, because it leads perfectly into the next question. Jim, you've shared an example, and Owen, you spoke a little bit about how difficult it is sometimes to poke holes in a developer's baby in their code. So when it comes to this, you know, problem-based training, how do we approach it with developers? How do we approach it with the people that we're trying to train?
Let me start. It's really simple. It's like respect. That's it. No matter what you're saying to a developer, like when a developer asks a really foolish question, be respectful and take it seriously.
Yeah, well, they're asking the question, right? That's the most important thing.
Exactly. Or a developer, someone speaks up and says something that's technically incorrect. Well, when you're going to critique them, take it easy on them. Be gentle. You know, don't try to be like a know-it-all in the room. Even though you're the professor, you're teaching, you're supposed to know this stuff. You got to have a little bit of humble pie when you're teaching, because like be one of them. Speak in developers' languages. Go out of your way more so than you normally would. If I'm talking with Owen, I never treat him with respect. I always like to say, right?
No,
so, sorry, Owen. No,
that's okay. No handbags. We'll do handbags later.
No, but this again, these subtle details matter when it comes to successful training. It really does. And like people are people, and I'm like, I'm gonna be sitting with them often for like 8 to 16 hours. That's a lot of time. I'm like, you're getting some Manico, you know, talking at you. So what I say matters. How I treat developers in a very subtle way radically matters.
For me, I think Jim has answered one side of the coin there, right? It's communication, respect. Not nobody's infallible, all that. But the other thing around how do you approach it? Like, for me, from a technical standpoint, is you're using output from things like vulnerability management, from penetration tests, from SAST, from ASM, from patch management, right? So some of those things we talked about already, vulnerability management output, right? Finding an exploit in code, going through, you know, the specific exact instance with the team that developed the code. We cover that off in terms of pen testing. It's similar. In terms of SAST, it's similar. ASM, patch management, a bit different. ASM can detect maybe an exposed service. ASM can detect an exposed API. ASM can detect, ASM is attack surface management, by the way, if anybody that doesn't know that. And also maybe poor patch management. So ASM can find a system sitting out there. Maybe people have forgotten about it. It isn't being nurtured and cared for, so it's way out of date in patches or whatever. It has loads of ports open and stuff like that. So we're not talking about code in that space. We're talking about the idea around, okay, let's talk about why the firewall rules are broken, which is exposing an API which you can transact in without authentication, right? Something like that, right? And what you're talking about there is you're giving them a real example. Again, it may be more of the ops space, right? But you're giving them examples around, okay, so this is real. We found this on your systems, to the class. How can we prevent this? So it may not be a technical conversation around what the firewall is, what the API does. It's more around, well, why did this happen? What process fell over? What process failed? How do we miss this trick? Because some of these things are really easy to find. I think last year, I'm just about to start the 23 stats report, but last year's stats report, we did an average of 2 million endpoints, and we found a couple of thousand or exposed remote desktop clients, right? And the remote desktop client is responsible for a lot of ransomware attacks. The Colonial Pipeline attack a couple of years ago was an exposed RDP. They got in, they took over the network, and ransomed the place, and the entire eastern seaboard was out without oil for a short period of time, right? So so it isn't just about code in some ways, even though I think that's the more common way of doing this. It can be around, why are we exposures? Why did we not detect this exposure before maybe edge scan did, or a breach occurred? How can we prevent that from happening? What's wrong with our process? Have we got visibility? Because ASM is all primarily about knowing our attack surface, and patch management, is clunky. It's unsexy. It's something that auditors and compliance people love. I certainly have no respect for patch management at all. I think it sucks, but it's a necessary evil. And if you do find something like that on a critical system where your ass is in the wind because something wasn't patched, you need to talk about that from a problem-based context in terms of, well, why was it not patched? Do we not have visibility of the system? Did somebody forget? Are we not writing things down? Do we not have a checklist? Do we not have a rotation of process management? So it doesn't always apply to code, but in terms of how you approach it, I think it can be used for a wide array of problems. It doesn't need to be just coding and exploits and injection attacks. It can be also the type of data that, for example, what that edge scan gets, that data can be used to sort of improve processes and stuff. I don't know. That's more where I am at this stuff.
So now that we've covered both sides of that coin, and I think through your talking right there, you kind of spurred a question from Shamil, which is, how do we get a customer to make sure that 100% of their IT assets are covered for vulnerability scanning?
Yeah. How do we make sure a customer does it?
Exactly.
That's a really tough one. But so if that's a customer, as in I'm paying for a service from them, or am I the customer? I'm not sure, but I think it's very much around being able to prove it, right? Being able to give an enumeration, an itinerary of what was covered, asking for that information. Most organizations that take this seriously can do this very easily. They can in effect in seconds dump an enumeration of, and they can be redacted and stuff. You don't have to give too much information out, but you can sort of say, we're constantly every couple of hours, our ASM is covering our landscape. We're doing EASM, or we're doing external ASM, which is we're covering off, like we're doing discovery. So if things like, are we integrating our visibility program with cloud? So as servers are spun up and ripped down and stuff, because that's always going to move. Static IP is not a thing in cloud. So DNS changes a lot. So at any point in time, all of it's a moving feast. Is really hard to track. But the ability to show that should be quite easy if people are employing some form of ASM and some form of cadence of vulnerability management to say, yeah, you know, all these assets have been tested in the last 72 hours, week, month, whatever the cadence is, and being able to show that. So something that's overlooked, I think, a little bit in the vulnerability management space is if you are a vendor to a client, and for compliance they want to ask you this stuff, you know, we're always going to have vulnerabilities. There's no point in hiding them. When we talk about cyber, and Jim alluded to it as well, it's sort of like a treadmill. It's never going to stop. We're going to keep doing this forever.
Yeah,
it's continuous improvement, all that stuff. You know, it's a treadmill, the way I look at it, right? Which I hate treadmills, but you know, that's the world we live in.
I like them, Eoin. I like treadmills.
I know you did. Look at you. Sure, look at you, Jim. You know, you're a new man. But but you know, well, you know, as I said, my BMI, I got it yesterday. I'm going in the reverse direction. So that's not for this webinar. That's for our health and welfare webinar we're going to do later on today, right?
One thing quickly, what I like about EdScan is I know you have integration with a lot of asset management platforms, or at least several asset management platforms. So like, you know, EdScan, you can like do your asset management scanning. There's a whole new space in that area.
There is, yeah.
Plug that data into EdScan. EdScan can assist with making sure like a variety of different asset management platforms are fully covered by EdScan services. So I like that. I like when I see like cloud-based services like yours have that kind of integration. It lets like all these enterprise asset trackers work directly with vulnerability management, and that's important.
Integrate or die. Integrate or die. Like, you know, any one vendor doesn't have all the answers, so you need to be able to share data. You know, but if you do that, and if you think about it, and you have various either open source, commercial, and services or SaaS services like EdScan, when you integrate the data and consolidate it into a singular view, so you don't have silos of data across your enterprise, because that's really hard to see what's going on if you have all these individual silos of data. It's very much around you know, trying to do that. But once you get that done, or if you get that done in terms of, to answer the question, which is, you know, I don't even remember the question was, I'm talking for so long, but the idea will be you should be able to simply show that you're doing it frequently, you're doing it on an ongoing basis, and what you're doing is dynamic. So you're keeping pace, particularly in cloud. You need to keep pace with change, keep pace with changes in terms of stuff being deployed, stuff being ripped down, changes in DNS. And the only way you can really do it, in our view, is to integrate with the cloud and pull the sort of the CMDB from the cloud, and then so because things are always changing, you're keeping pace with that change. So I hope that sort of answers the question. Maybe it doesn't, but apologies if it doesn't.
Well, there is a second part to that question that I'm going to save until the end of this, just so we can stay on the problem-based cybersecurity training. So we talked about problem-based cybersecurity training. We talked about why it's effective. We talked about how we can approach it. And now, Jim, I'm going to redirect to you to talk about how we can measure the effectiveness of problem-based training.
First of all, this is difficult to do. This is not something that a lot of my customers in the training world do. And I train a lot of the Fortune 500. Now, some of my customers do want to track this. And what they'll do is these are customers that have some kind of like vulnerability management in play, where they can actually see the vulnerability trends over time. Like, you know, show me like my scan data over a year and continue. I know EdScan's got a lot of those kind of features, and now I can see the vulnerability cadence over time rather than just at one point in time. So if I can see that cadence, we can look at the vulnerabilities that have shown up on a certain team over the last like 3 or 4 months. We can see a point in time where training has been done. And then watch the vulnerability count with that particular team over the next couple of months. And like, especially for application teams that have gone through training for the first time, like I've seen statistics where like 90+% of critical vulnerabilities dropped off in the next month. And that we can see that statistically, because we're teaching them SQL injection, XSS, basic authentication issues, really high impact stuff that's easy to fix, where they can get quick wins, and the vulnerability count will drop off. And usually that's not the perfect way to analyze the world, but it's real data showing, holy cow, we did training and X vulnerabilities dropped out. And that's a real world demonstration of financial numerical value to do training. And I had like several large companies do that kind of study around my training, and it demonstrated that critical drop off. That we would see medium level vulnerabilities drop off at a lower percent, and lows almost unaffected by training.
Yeah.
So I saw like the critical and mediums, like definitely showed statistical drop off every time I was studied.
No, you're right. Totally agree with that, Jim. You know, measuring effectiveness is around, well, if we have a continuous environment which is continuously changing and we're continuously assessing for weaknesses, we can possibly measure metrics. So metrics are key. Metrics are key. Why? Because bottom line, we want to be secure, robust, and resilient, but also at the executive level, security managers and CIOs and CISOs need to show why they need a decent chunk of budget every year to maintain the security of the business, right? So, you know, without metrics, you can't do that. So metrics are super important, right? So the idea of, I mentioned, is consolidation of data, consolidation of vulnerabilities, putting it into a sort of a place where you can reference, cross-reference and stuff like that. And it's something we've worked really hard with in EdgeCon to do, but it's sort of like that. So, but if we have a good flow of metrics, we can start to measure occurrence, which is exactly, so the idea would be, you know, Manico came in, trained business unit X, Y, and Z. Most development teams now are deploying in an iterative way, so they're deploying every month, every 2 months. You know, some of them even every day or every week. But over time, you know, if you can measure that over a 6-month period, as Jim said, you can start to say, oh, look, injection attacks have dropped off. Why? Because all of a sudden, you know, some of the stuff that they learned, they maybe adopted. You know, different ways of doing things. Maybe the peer review process, the code review process, the peer review process has decided to focus on those things. You can't fix everything. And it's so true that like low and medium, low risk and informational risk issues, for me, you know, it's like sandwich filler. It's like you have the nice meat and the cheese and the lettuce, tomatoes, but you might have some other stuff in there which isn't that important if it wasn't there in the first place, right? But you have it and it exists. And for me, they would be the sort of the informational things. You know, most mature people in our industry realize not every vulnerability is born equal. And we can only fix the things that matter. So prioritization is a big challenge, you know. So something we've done in EdgeCon is we've mapped the vulnerabilities to like the CSAT exploit catalog. So if there are vulnerabilities that we find, and if they're also mentioned or listed in the exploit catalog, it means they're really being exploited in the wild. So, you know, that helps with prioritization, etc. But ultimately, if you have metrics, then you can start to measure per business unit or per dev team. You can measure per app and measurement. So the only way you can really ensure or help showing why are we investing our time? Why am I pulling 40 developers out for a 2-day class, which is like, you know, 80 man days of development time. Why am I doing this? Because you can see that the critical risks or the exposures and the things that could potentially affect the business in a negative way, from compliance, legislation, fine, PCI, whatever it may be, those things, those risks are reducing. Those risks are going away. You know, they'll never go away fully. As we deploy more code, statistically, we'll always have more vulnerabilities. But the thing is that maybe we're not seeing as many critical and high risk issues anymore. We're seeing some mediums and lows, and you know, but we need to sort of tighten down, ratchet down the screws a bit tighter. But we need to start somewhere, and generally that's at a high priority risk, and you move down. But in terms of effectiveness, the training, you know, is without a doubt super important, because we're empowering developers to be security people, but you can't expect them to be security experts, but they need to be conscious of security. I think that's probably a bad way to put it, but Jim, you probably have a much better way to say that. But in doing that as well, you know, if you can measure across your entire estate, across your full stack, you know, and to do that over time, you can start to see where the return on investment occurs. Jim, have you anything else to cool?
Just what I like, what I would say is, like, developers don't need to be security experts, but a developer needs access to an application security expert throughout the SDLC. And this is a non-negotiable requirement. If your developers don't have access to some AppSec lead or AppSec champion, the chance of that team doing security well is 0. And like that, and I've seen, I love it that I can use edge scan and ask questions on individual vulnerabilities, start interacting with your engineers and ask questions there. That's often suitable to handle individual vulnerabilities. Devs want to talk about it if they don't have the expertise. And this is what the security champion is for, the security lead or security engineer, embed it with your team, or using a service or consultancy where they have regular seamless access through a portal to ask questions. This is not negotiable.
It's not a nice to have.
Critical requirement if you want to do security. And a lot of groups are missing this.
You're right, man. I agree.
Agree. No, beautifully said, beautifully said. And so the next question that we have is, what are the problems that we can use as training content? I know we did touch on that a little bit earlier. That's good, because we are running low on time. So I'm going to do this one last question based around problem-based training, and then we have a couple queued up more around vulnerabilities and edge scan in our Q&A portal.
Cool.
So the last question around the cybersecurity training is, what are the most important pieces to form a decent problem-based cyber training program?
I got some ideas, Eoin.
I thought you might, Jim.
For me, it's metrics. For me, it's decent training. But like, with the likes of Manico if you're using the likes of Manico, like Jim's been doing this for so long, he pretty much knows an answer to most developer problems, or seen most developer problems. But the training is one piece, but you need to measure improvement. And the last thing for me is to explain exploits and explain weaknesses in code and exposures in layman's terms. Cyber people are notoriously guilty of using fancy, probably militaristic words and sort of sexy words, hacker words, to explain what the issue is. And we love doing that. We all love it.
Indirect object reference, service forgery, whatever.
But let's talk about it in terms of, if this happens, this will happen, and therefore something bad will happen, and do it in a very, very simple way. I think that's a very important part of the training aspect.
Jim?
The thing that I found is led to successful, like, getting business, right? Getting people to want to do training is, no one training should be the same. And this is hard. It takes a little flexibility, right? And so as I developed my content over the last 14 years, I've broken up all of my content into individual learning modules. So I don't maintain one slide deck. I maintain about 100 different slide decks for each of the different topics I cover. And so when I go to engage with the customer, I'm like, what are you doing? What I want to look at is, I want to understand your tech stack, just high level. I want to understand the kind of app you're building, and I want to see your edge scan data. I want to give me a login to edge scan. Let me see your edge scan vulnerability data. And just based on those three things, I can now pick and choose from all the different modules and know what to focus on. If someone's using orbs or orms, I may not get in a SQL injection. If edge scan lights them up with 50 SQL injection live, we're going to have a little talk, the full hour and a half or more. We're going to get into it, because you're obviously having a problem there. So just doing, I don't support turnkey trainings for all. They tend to be very ineffective. I have to do that at a conference, but that's the last kind. So give me some edge scan data. Let me know your tech stack. Let me have a brief conversation with you, and then I can build a custom training to maximize value. And so that's how I like to roll when engaging training engagements.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys very much. So then I'm going to move over to our Q&A right now. So we have some more questions, more so surrounding vulnerabilities and edge scan itself. So we have one from Robert. It says, does edge scan use CTI to aid with its risk rating system, or provide threat intelligence-led vulnerability management to their clients?
Yeah. Okay. Good one. Good question. We prioritize vulnerabilities. So there's a few things, right? We have a blunt instrument we all know and love called CVSS. Don't give it much credence, because CVSS, just because something has an 8 out of 10 doesn't mean it's exploitable, but it's more of a compliance thing. I think that the world is moving away from that. The second thing we have is edge scan risk rating. Edge scan risk rating is, particularly with high and critical risks, is that our pen testing team, which are CREST and OSCP certified guys in the SOC, those guys in effect will look at the vulnerability, the context, is it authenticated, is it unauthenticated, what the application is, how critical the application is, all that stuff. And we do that when we onboard the asset, such that if it's a particular type of vulnerability, we'll risk rate it as such. The third thing we do is with the CISA, CISA government institution in the US has a thing called the vulnerability exploitability catalog, I think it's called, or yeah, the catalog of exploitable vulnerabilities or something like this. But we have a mapping there which is constantly updated on a everyday basis. So as we find vulnerabilities which are listed there, it means that the risk rating will pop up and they're highlighted as items which are actually being exploited currently in the wild, particularly around things like ransomware groups or various other types of threat actors, but they're based on the US government's experience of protecting, I'm guessing, US interests. But they are kind enough to share that, which is very, very useful. So the idea will be is that even though a vulnerability is according to a tool or a scanner in the traditional sense, if you're still using, so some of the more incumbent tool vendors, the risk may not be always the most important thing that the tool is reporting that you should fix, right? Prioritization is important, but to get prioritization, you need validation first. So validation is around making sure the vulnerability is real in the first place, and is it exploitable? If you get a SQL injection, but then there's some controls on the database, which the account you're writing the SQL injection on is a very low level account, you may not be able to do much even though it is technically a SQL injection. Is that a critical risk issue? Probably not. Does it look bad? Certainly does. Is it a clear and present danger to my business? No, it's not. So exploitability and validation are really important before you apply the prioritization piece. That's my 10 cents there.
Beauteous. Well, Robert, I hope that answered your question. And now we have a couple more questions from Shamil. And so what I've gathered is I believe this is from a vendor perspective. So I believe that Shamil is asking this like as if he is a vendor. And so once this customer has all of their assets covered, which vulnerability should be patched first to patch the most critical vulnerabilities?
Go for it, Jim, please.
Just a few brief notes. Like I like to have like a grid between the criticality and the ease of fix. So I really like to go for my critical and medium quick wins first, like things that I can just fix your SQL inject, things I can bust out, get merged in quickly without a lot of organizational stress. I like to get those quick wins out right away. Then I want to start working on critical vulnerabilities that are going to take some time and work through those as best I can. Sometimes I want to do some kind of mitigating factor instead. Maybe I'll even drop the feature until I fix it. But I don't just want to fix critical things first, because some criticals are huge amounts of effort. They're going to tie up a lot of resources and are not reducing risk across the system in as net effective way as just like getting my quick win, like high level quick wins merged as quickly as I can. So ahead, Owen. I know you have a lot of time in this space. What do you got, Owen?
Oh my God. So if it's critical, yeah, I totally agree. Like, it's critical, but is it exploitable? If it's critical, should it be up the top of the list? It could be a design fix. It could be hundreds of hours of development work to fix it. It could be a line of code, maybe even a couple of characters to fix it. So as you said, if you had a half a dozen criticals, you probably go for the easy ones. I totally agree with that one. And then again, you need to look at prioritization. So some vulnerabilities are actively used by ransomware. They're parts of ransomware toolkits. They're parts of these sort of homemade, well, not homemade, but you can buy these toolkits on the dark web. And in effect, you can build your own ransomware, and they're using known vulnerabilities. They're not using 0 days, because 0 days are worth too much to sell in a toolkit for the majority of cases. But very much it's around stuff that's actively used. If we know it's being actively exploited, there could be a bot out there looking for this particular vulnerability. Once it finds it, it phones home and tells the adversary to go and look at this place here. It appears to have that vulnerability you're looking for. So prioritization in terms of actively being leveraged as part of or solely currently on the internet is important. So prioritization is really important, but you need to, where do you reference that from is the key thing.
Thank you very much, Owen. And then Jim, I'll go back to you. This is from Shamil again, once again, coming from the vendor perspective. We've seen that a lot of customers are experiencing vulnerability chaos. Could it be the customers do not know which vulnerability belongs to which asset owners? How do we deal with this issue?
Well, part of running a vulnerability management program is tracking, right? You like Edge Scan, you can show list of different applications and vulnerability history per application, and that solves the problem. If your customer is experiencing vulnerability chaos, they're likely not using the right tools. They're using a spreadsheet. They're not using a more formal vulnerability management platform. And it takes a little bit of organization and the right product to get you to that. So, Shamil, you need enterprise Edge Scan license, and this is going to solve your problem. And I'm not being facetious when I say that. This is what the whole point of Edge Scan type services are all about, to help you take this huge chaotic mess of vulnerability data and put it in a reasonable to use user interface to see what's going on. And if you don't have that, there's no way to easily measure what you're doing. So I say vulnerability chaos is when you're not using a formal vulnerability management platform, and you're not like tracking this data appropriately. You're throwing stuff in crappy spreadsheets. Yeah, that's chaotic. So get yourself some Edge Scan. That's what I have to say.
Oh, and do you have anything to add to that?
I'm with him.
That was poetry. Oh, you can't stop poetry. So there you go.
Alrighty, guys. So that does bring us to the end of our agenda for the day, and I don't have any more questions to answer. Do you guys have any final notes to add to this, or are we ready to hop off and get ready for the next webinar?
No, it's always fun chatting with the Edge Scan team, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. I run into you quite a bit in my own customer base, some of the big ones. So hey, you're doing great work. Keep it up, and thanks for having me on your show.
Jim, thanks a lot, man. Have a great enjoy Amsterdam.
Yes, sir.
And
here for work.
We'll catch up with you next week, maybe.
Yes, sir.
Alrighty, guys. Well, thank you guys so much for having me as the moderator. I feel like I learned a whole lot today, and I was really happy to be able to take part in this. And then anybody who's here right now, anybody watching, anybody who has any questions, be on the lookout. We do have some more webinars coming out. Our marketing team is getting on that as we speak. Hopefully, they'll be announced shortly. Thank you guys for all joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Cheers.